Hello everybody, this is Grandmaster Georg Meier bringing you part 3 of the series on the Catalan Opening from White's point of view. So let's get to our starting position again after g3. And in the first two videos we talked about Black's bluntest or most direct tries to keep the pawn after d takes c4. So after bishop g2 in part 1 we looked at b5, and in the second video we looked at a slightly more sophisticated way to do the same by way of a6, castles and b5. And in both cases Black was struggling because exposing the long diagonal meant that after a move like knight e5, Black always had to lose time to simply obstruct the long diagonal. So today we are going to look at another try for Black to still try to keep this pawn on c4 alive, but without making so many concessions. So the move is knight c6, and the point is, well, first of all, we kind of stop the most obvious way for White to regain the pawn, which would be with knight e5. And also queen a4 isn't possible, since after a6 Black always has b7, b5. So there's no way. But still there are drawbacks to the move knight c6. Mainly, in general, Black is not so happy to obstruct the c7 pawn, because the white pawn on d4 means a long-term superiority in the center, having a little bit more space and already control over the e5 square. So there's definitely a trade-off. And the way I recommend to play for White is simply to go e3, protecting the pawn on d4. And right now White is threatening to play knight bd2 and regain the pawn on c4. So this is also why we need to overprotect the pawn on d4. So of course Black needs to be consistent and try to still keep the pawn on c4. And one way to do this is, as appears to be, rook b8. But after rook b8 we have the very strong move knight d2. Since now b5 is not possible, c6 would be hanging. And also Black cannot defend with knight a5. There's queen a4 check, attacking the knight on a5. The c6 is still protected by the queen from d8, but now b4 is very strong. And after taking, knight is not yet lost, there is b6, b4, but after knight b7 then White is just regaining even more than just to one pawn. So some people have still experimented with rook b8, and after knight fd2 they tried e5, but this is a pawn sacrifice where Black simply does not have enough in this position. So let's go back a couple of moves. It turns out that the way for Black to protect on, to keep this pawn alive is to go bishop d7. Now, since the knight is protected on c6, Black is ready any time to play b7, b5. And we go queen e2. Of course, Black should protect on c4 by playing b5. There have been some games playing bishop d6, which I think is simply inconsequent. White takes, castles. Now it is quite clear that Black has to go e6, e5 in the near future to challenge White's center. So White gets ready for the opening of the d-file with rook d1. And e5 is also still not possible, because here b7 would be hanging. So to prepare e5, Black would have to go rook b8. And White just prepares for opening of the a1, h8 diagonal, going b3, e5, bishop b2. And this kind of position is just very pleasant for White. Let's say after some logical exchanges like this, the white pieces are ready to basically get to very harmonious squares, knight d2, rook ac1, and white is just enjoying a more harmonious and active position. So let's go back again to the principled move here, which is b7, b5. And now comes a very interesting moment, because for a number of years the white players have tried direct things like knight e5, which looks quite appealing, putting pressure on the long diagonal. But after taking on a8, it turns out that all the white squares are really weak, and black has long-term compensation for the exchange here sacrificed. And also this bishop from d7 is anytime ready to get onto the long diagonal. And similar try would be to go knight c3, and after, let's say, bishop e7, knight e5, takes, black just goes knight d5 and gives back the pawn. And here there are no special problems for black, just equal material, and black is gonna finish his development. So let's have some detailed look at the position. And still, what I said earlier, the main drawback of playing knight c6 is having this backward pawn on c7. And it turns out it makes a lot of sense for white to remove the pawn from c4 and open the c file. So the best way to play is the positional pawn sacrifice b3. Of course, black has to take. And now we are following a game Ivan Schuck against Van Veli, so with white it's an absolute super grandmaster. Van Veli, of course, continues development, and white just calmly goes bishop b2, rook c1, like I said, occupying the c file where there are lots of juicy targets on c6 and c7. And black felt compelled to already remove the knight from c6, going knight b4. But knight b4 invites white to just jump to e5. And after rook c8, we have a key position for the understanding of this whole pawn sacrifice. So the only drawback from white's point of view is, of course, being a pawn down, but there's still this backward pawn on c7, there's a target on a6, and the piece that holds the black position together, so to say, is this knight on b4 that protects to some extent the square on c6 and the pawn on a6. So, the only piece that white hasn't developed yet is the knight on b1. So something like knight c3 or knight d2 wouldn't be exactly to the point, but with the strong piece on the knight on b4 that we would like to exchange ideally, there's a very strong maneuver for white to go knight a3 with the idea to simply go knight c2. So if black would wait only one move, then after knight c2 and exchanges there, he would suffer a lot, because a6 would be about to fall, and also white would be ready to occupy the c6 square, completely blocking the black queenside. So black is forced to go c5, at least removing one weakness. So after takes, it looks like black has some sort of relief, but white just continues his plan. Knight c2, exchanges, black went queen b6 to protect simultaneously on c5 and a6. And black still seems to be hanging on. Because, okay, white is active, a nice knight on e5, but everything in black position is protected. And if black was given a bit more time, he would probably manage to finish development and more or less consolidate. For instance, to play rook d8 and bishop b8 would be one way to finish development. So now is the moment when white needs to do something. All the pieces are developed and it's time to try to take advantage of the more active placement of pieces. So kind of a standard way to play would be knight d3. Bishop has to move, and after bishop d4 we take over the queenside. So black still tries to defend on a6, but then bishop c5, and we take on a6. And now we get like a typical Catalan position where simply white's pieces are more active. Just look at bishop on g2 and rook on a6 compared to bishop d7 and rook f8 that are not doing anything. So after changes on c5 and b3, b4 coming, white would just enjoy a long-term positional advantage, pressing for a win without any risk. So that would be a nice way to play, but Ivanchuk found an even more aggressive way. He went g4, so his idea is of course to go g5 and then d7 would be hanging after the knight has to leave f6. Black goes rook d8, bringing the rook into play and defending d7. White continues g5, knight d5, and now a very typical idea of white was used when you kick the knight from f6. The black king side doesn't have any protection from pieces, and Ivanchuk used this, playing bishop e4, attacking on h7 and forcing black to create new weaknesses around his king. So of course g6 is something you really don't want to do, because the long diagonal is going to become extremely weak, and after moves like knight g4 at any point you would expect to be mated very quickly as black. So black felt compelled to play f5, and now Ivanchuk went for transformation of the position. Here white was just seriously better with a very strong bishop on b2 and already seriously exposed black king. So after, for instance, rook c1, bishop f8, h4, it would be very hard to see how black can survive. Because if white is allowed to go h5, g6 or even h5, h6, then simply the black king is going to be opened up too much, and it's also difficult to challenge the white queen, because something like queen g6 would, among others, just allow white to win a pawn. Ivanchuk showed us already some key ideas. For instance, to play knight f3 at this point. And I want to go back a little bit to discuss alternatives for black. For example, at this point, of course, black was not yet forced to go knight b4 and to allow white to jump to e5. It's maybe logical to go knight d5, also aiming at having two knights that can control the b4 square, where the knight seems to be placed quite well. And now another idea is possible for white. We go knight c3, the point being that now the knight can go through e4 to c5, which is another very juicy target for white, but as long as the black knight was on f6, it was simply not possible to get to c5 in such a direct manner. And going back again a little bit, in this position, other than bishop e7, basically every legal development of the bishop has been tried. But once we have understood the key ideas, not much is changing for white. For instance, bishop b4, bishop b2, castles, rook c1, and now knight d5 has the added benefit that now after knight c3, a lot of pieces could be exchanged on c3, which eases the task of the side with less space. So here we don't go knight c3, but another nice idea is going knight e1, wanting to win a tempo against the bishop on b4, because black cannot afford to lose this bishop and leave the black squares without any protection. So black basically has to lose another tempo. And now also we don't need to play knight d3 immediately, which is a good move, but we can go back to the idea knight c3 and go knight e4 here. And when we stopped c7, c5, it's actually not clear at all how black can free himself ever. So a plausible variation would be a5, knight c5, c6. But here we kick one knight from d5 and then we attack the remaining knight on b4. And if we manage to take on b4, then the knight from e1 is ready to pick up the lone pawn on b4. And all this while keeping our superiority in the center. So we've seen a lot of different key ideas, and now I would just like to show you one more game where Tomaszewski was playing white, same as before. Tomaszewski, Russian Super Grandmaster over 2700. Knight b4, knight e5, and instead of rook c8 as Van Veli played, Tomaszewski's opponent played rook b8. And here again, knight a3 would be a perfectly good move. But Tomaszewski decided to basically show that it's not even necessary to rush, because knight a3, knight c2 is like really the fastest way to get rid of the b4 knight, and I also think the best one. But his play was quite instructive nevertheless. He went knight d2, and also he's of course helped that black cannot play c5 yet. So black went rook b6, knight f3, bishop c8. We actually see that if black doesn't play for c7, c5, then he has no idea at all in this position. And he's basically trying to rearrange his pieces to go knight d7 to exchange some. Now Tomaszewski showed the point of his previous knight moves. He went knight d1. So finally he's ready to go knight d3 and exchange his powerful knight on b4. And he wants to have one knight in any case ready to then jump to c5. So black went knight d7. And as I said before, the side with less space was obviously cramped here. Black likes, of course, to exchange pieces. And as white, we only want to get rid of the knight on b4. So white goes knight 5 to d3, exchanges that strong knight on b4. And again, c5 is forever under control, so black marked time playing bishop d6. Probably with the idea of going queen e7 and then hoping that c5 becomes possible. But white goes e4, bishop b7, knight c5, bishop c8 back. Of course, black's play looks kind of pointless, but he is also a grandmaster almost 2600, and as they say, when the position is bad, it's difficult to find a good move. And he was basically just trying more or less to stand and try to survive. But here white can just gain more space, going e5, and after bishop e7 we have a position where white has all the time in the world to make improvements to his position and eventually break through. Typical move to just make a small improvement is going h4, just gaining some space on the king's side, and white could soon follow up with queen e3, then bishop c3, bishop a5, and eventually the weaknesses will prove just too numerous for black to defend. So let's go back a little bit and just recap what we learned about this variation. So the new move in the series for black was knight c6. Instead of opening up the long diagonal, just trying to keep the pawn on c4 alive while developing pieces. And white just goes modestly e3, planning to attack the pawn on c4 again, and bishop d7 is kind of a more or less ugly way to develop the bishop, because it would be much nicer to have it one day on the long diagonal, challenging the bishop on g2, but it's all with the idea of keeping the pawn on c4 alive. And then queen e2, provoking b5, leaving all these weaknesses on the c file that the b pawn cannot protect anymore. And now using the fact that the c file has been weakened so much by b3. And I think b3 and the ideas that I illustrated are like really refuting the whole setup for black. So as always, if you have comments or questions to these videos, I welcome you to post them in the comments, and I'll be happy to look into the comments and reply to the questions. Thank you.